Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 28th of April. I'm Erin Viner, and this is IBA News broadcasting from Jerusalem. We again open in the north amid rising tensions, including the firing of 2 mortars from Syria that landed on the Israeli side of the Golan Heights near kibbutz Ein Zivan. Area residents were startled by the sounding of red alert sirens around noon after the mortar fire was detected about 1 kilometer from the frontier. There were no casualties and no reported damage caused by the projectiles. Defense officials say that they believe that the incident is part of spillover violence from the nearby fighting between Syrian government forces and opposition rebels, and that it does not appear that Israeli territory was intentionally targeted. In the West Bank, a Palestinian died of wounds he sustained in clashes with IDF soldiers near the settlement of Shaked. 18-year-old Mohammed Saleh was shot after he was spotted trying to cut through the security barrier and refused orders to halt. He was the 3rd Palestinian suspect to have died in violent flare-ups with soldiers in as many days. Rescue efforts are ongoing in quake-stricken Nepal today, where authorities say that the revised death toll is now expected to reach as many as 10,000 victims. The whereabouts of just 11 Israeli visitors to the country remain unaccounted for, and despite the harsh weather conditions, 2 helicopters dispatched by the Har El search team successfully rescued dozens of Israelis stranded in the Langtang region. We get more from IBA's Margot Dudkevich.
A plane carrying some 229 Israeli hikers and 15 babies, stranded in Nepal following Saturday's earthquake, arrived back in the country at noon today. Yesterday, 2 separate flights returned 250 Israelis and 8 babies born to surrogate mothers in Nepal, accompanied by their Israeli parents.
We were caught on surprise with our babies and little children. In a city that is part of the third world, and in the course of the last 48 hours, we were in constant fear of our lives and our babies' lives.
Amid a rising death toll of 4,600 fatalities, the government in Nepal declared 3 days of mourning today for those who perished in the massive earthquake. Prime Minister Sushil Koirala told reporters he feared the numbers of fatalities could climb to 10,000 and appealed to the world to send tents and medical supplies. The United Nations estimates up to 8 million people have had their lives disrupted in the deadly earthquake that rocked the country. Israel's foreign ministry said today the number of Israelis estimated to have been traveling in Nepal that is still unaccounted for is at 11. A sharp decrease from previous days. Ministry officials said they've managed to locate 50 Israelis in Langtang, 15 in the Mount Everest area, and 20 in the last resort in Annapurna. Yesterday, members of the Har El Rescue and Search Unit located 4 Israelis in the Mount Everest area and took them to safety. Israel's foreign ministry asked the Nepalese army for assistance after several Israeli rescue helicopters were overrun with survivors asking for help. Today, authorities said all of the climbers who were stranded at camps high up on Mount Everest had been airlifted to safety. Several international rescue teams were forced to either fly home or land in neighboring countries because of severe congestion at Kathmandu's only international airport that is limited in the number of aircraft it can serve. Shortly after their arrival in Kathmandu, members of the Army's search and rescue team began setting up a field hospital near a local Nepalese military base damaged in the quake. Nepalese soldiers welcomed their Israeli counterparts and assisted them in loading the equipment and medical supplies onto trucks.
We have just landed over here after a very long flight from Israel. We did everything that we can to be as fast as possible on ground in order to save lives over here with search and rescue teams and our hospital, field hospital, in order to be here to save lives, to help the people over here on ground.
Israeli medics and doctors worked shoulder to shoulder with local medical staff, offering a brief respite to doctors at Kathmandu's Bir Hospital, who have been working around the clock to treat the constant flow of injured people.
If the number of patients rises, then it could be a problem that we would be suffering from lack of bed just immediate post-operatively.
Many of the stranded Israelis took refuge in the Chabad house in Kathmandu that was also damaged in the earthquake. Despite the harsh conditions and no electricity, Rabbi Hesky Lifshitz and his wife Hani still managed to provide a hot meal. Each passing day reveals the massive damage caused by the quake. Bhaktapur, one of the country's ancient towns famed for its temples and pagoda-like structures, was reduced to rubble. In the streets of Kathmandu, people prepared to camp outside for yet another night. Some accused their government of failing to provide them with food and water. Others said they were too scared to return to their homes, and others are left with no home to go back to.
Yeah, about 100 people over here. We don't have food, water supply, everything. We are sitting here from first day to now, I think 5 days. And nothing is coming from government.
Rescue units in the coming days will be saddled with the momentous task of searching for survivors and treating the wounded, and supplying shelters and food for the tens of thousands of people left with nothing. Margot Dudkevich, IBA News.
Many Americans are wondering what today will bring to Baltimore, where it's morning now, following a night of unprecedented rioting that included anti-white violence, arson, and looting, prompting the governor to declare a state of emergency in Maryland's largest city. We get more from IBA's Aryeh O'Sullivan.
Rioting began on Monday following the funeral of Freddie Gray, an African-American who died in police custody a week ago. Starting from a mall, the rioters were mostly angry black youth, and their protests turned violent. Hundreds confronted police, hurling stones and makeshift firebombs. Baltimore Mayor Stephanie Rawlings Blake appeared to add fuel to the flames when she called for rioters to be given space to protest. Coming under fire, she said she was taken out of context and ordered that a week-long nighttime curfew be imposed on the city of some 650,000 residents, about an hour north of Washington, D.C.
Yeah, this is one of our darkest days as a city, and I know that we're much better than this. We know that the world is watching, and we cannot allow our city to devolve into chaos because of a small group of criminals that are moving throughout our city.
This footage shows a mob of looters dragging a shop owner from his store and beating him. At least 15 police officers were injured in the rioting and dozens of vehicles destroyed. The situation was so bad, the baseball game was canceled. Meanwhile, firefighters battled blazes across the city as police and National Guard moved in to restore order. But in at least one instance, it was the mother of a rioter who had to whip some sense into her son to keep him off the streets.
And if you saw on one scene, you had one mother who grabbed their child who had a hood on his head, and she started smacking him on the head because she was so embarrassed. I wish I had more parents that took charge of the kids out there tonight.
Aryeh O'Sullivan for IBA News.
It will be harder to support Israel at the UN if Jerusalem is not committed to a two-state solution. That's the message from U.S. Undersecretary of State Wendy Sherman while speaking to Jewish leaders from the Reform Movement.
As you know, we have always had Israel's back in the international arena, and we have repeatedly stood up against efforts to delegitimize Israel or single Israel out unfairly, even when it meant standing alone. That has been the case and will continue to be the case. As we've said, it's true that Prime Minister Netanyahu raised questions about his government's commitment to a two-state solution in comments he made right before and right after the Israeli election. Now he's working to form a government as we speak, with a deadline approaching, and I certainly don't and won't want to get ahead of that process. We will be watching very closely to see what happens after a new government is formed on this issue of working towards two states living side by side in peace and security. If the new Israeli government is seen as stepping back from its commitment to a two-state solution, something that all of you and a vast majority of American Jews supports, That makes our job in the international arena a lot tougher, because our ability to push back on efforts to internationalize efforts to address Israeli-Palestinian issues has depended on our insistence that the best course in achieving a two-state solution is through direct negotiation between the parties. The administration is also absolutely committed to doing all that we can to combat rising anti-Semitism, including by supporting our European allies' efforts, where we've tragically seen this hatred rear its ugly head too often in the past year. We helped to plan the historic UN General Assembly session on anti-Semitism, at which scores of countries from throughout the world stood up to condemn anti-Semitism, and we will continue to make crystal clear that anti-Semitism has absolutely no place in legitimate policy differences over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
With just 8 days to go before the coalition deadline, many question whether a national unity government is within the realm of possibility. No, according to Times of Israel editor David Horovitz, who explains why he believes the formation of a coalition has been taking so long, to IBA's Eli Wogelenter.
Look, the law gives you 6 weeks, and that's the way it is, that if you've got 6 weeks to form a coalition, you're going to take 6 weeks to form a coalition. I assume, honestly, if there had been a 4-week deadline rather than 4 weeks with the possible extension of another 2, they'd have got the coalition together in 4 weeks. A lot of it is a game of chicken. Most of the cards were in Netanyahu's hands. You know, people don't want to acknowledge his potential partners, that it's either agree to his terms more or less, or risk infuriating your voters and creating all sorts of pressures and who knows, new elections and so on. That was never realistic, and therefore so it goes to the wire. But I think we all knew pretty much fairly early on what the coalition would look like, and I still tend to think that that's the coalition that we'll have.
There's a story today about pressure being brought to bear on Netanyahu in forming his coalition from the United States. That pressure buttressed last night by words from Undersecretary of State Wendy Sherman that they're waiting to see the coalition and where it stands on the two-state solution. Do you believe that story?
I have no doubt that just as Netanyahu would rather that somebody other than Obama had been president for the last few years, the Obama administration, would rather that someone other than Netanyahu was prime minister, and certainly would rather a more diverse coalition with relatively moderate parties than a right-wing Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox coalition. And by the way, it's not just Wendy Sherman. I mean, Obama himself has said, you know, in the wake of the elections, we're going to evaluate our approach to the peace process and so on, and he didn't accept Netanyahu's walk back on the two-state solution and so on. So clearly the United States is sending signals. If behind the scenes there's pressure, you know, I don't know. Does that mean, you know, I personally don't at this stage see any reason to think that Israel is heading for anything other than that 67-seat coalition. And Netanyahu doesn't want Isaac Herzog in his coalition, in my opinion, and Herzog does not want to be in Netanyahu's coalition as the sort of fig leaf. You know, if it turns out that in the next few days there's a radical shift and Netanyahu starts, you know, trying to woo Herzog, you know, then we'll be looking at a very different political map. I don't see it. I don't see the commonality of interests. It reopens all the complexities of the other potential partners. It's kind of, I mean, you could argue that the electorate, as ever, because it gave lots of seats to Labour as well as rather more seats to the Likud, would be more widely and consensually represented in a unity coalition. I think you could argue more strongly that the electorate signalled a certain preference. You know, why was it that Ruby Rivlin charged Netanyahu with forming the coalition? Who were the parties that recommended Netanyahu as prime minister? Well, that's the way it seems to be playing out.
But Herzog wouldn't necessarily be a fig leaf. He'd be the foreign minister. His party would get a lot of ministries. The issues that are being discussed on the table would be off the table because those parties would not be part of the government. Doesn't this have a chance of being a long-lasting government?
You know, I don't think it's impossible, but I think we've been down a very similar road before in previous coalitions where you had representation of parties to Netanyahu's left, who then spent a lot of time, arguing with Netanyahu and arguing with other coalition players. You know, we saw how the last coalition fell apart when the center-lefty parties, Yesh Atid, Hatznua, which were in the coalition, made Netanyahu's life miserable. He said, couldn't work with him, they said. You know, is it plausible and likely that Herzog, even if he has lots of seats around the cabinet table, he's not going to have a majority for any of the significant things that he would want to differ with Netanyahu about? I don't see it. Again, this could turn out to be wrong, and there could be a real revolution in the negotiations. I just don't see it. I don't think Netanyahu wants it. I don't think Herzog thinks it's good for the Labour Party. Herzog has said over and over, we're going to be the strong opposition. You know, we don't have the votes to run the country the way we would want to run the country, and therefore we're better off leading opposition. That, to me, still seems by far the most likely outcome.
U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry met at the United Nations with Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif on the sidelines of the World Body's Conference on the Global Anti-Nuclear Weapons Treaty. The two top diplomats are trying to make progress in talks toward the securing of a long-term atomic deal between Iran and the P5+1 world powers. In an address to those assembled, Kerry said that the two sides are closer than ever to reaching an agreement. Speaking on behalf of the 120-nation non-aligned movement, Zarif told delegates that the real nuclear problems are posed by NATO and Israel.
For this treaty to remain upright, we need to ensure its words have weight, that its rules are binding, and that its parties are compliant. And that means that the world has to remain united in rejecting the proliferation of nuclear weapons anywhere. So today, there is the potential for historic progress towards that end. The United States and our P5+1 partners have come together with Iran around a series of parameters that, if finalized and implemented, will close off all of Iran's possible pathways to the nuclear material required for a nuclear weapon, and give the international community the confidence that it needs to know that Iran's nuclear program is indeed exclusively peaceful. I want you to know the hard work is far from over, and some key issues remain unresolved. But we are, in fact, closer than ever to the good, comprehensive deal that we have been seeking. And if we can get there, the entire world will be safer.
We remain deeply concerned by military and security doctrines of the nuclear weapon states, as well as that of NATO, in which they justify the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons and maintain the irrational concept of security based on nuclear deterrence and nuclear military alliances. We firmly believe that any use or threat of use of nuclear weapons would be a crime against humanity and a violation of the principles of the Charter of the United Nations and international law, in particular, international humanitarian law. They express great concern over the acquisition of nuclear capability by Israel, which poses a serious and continuing threat to the security of neighboring and other states, and condemned Israel for continuing to develop and stockpile nuclear arsenals. They also called for the total and complete prohibition of the transfer of all nuclear-related equipment, information, material and facilities, resources or devices, and the extension of assistance in the nuclear-related scientific or technological fields to Israel.
The head of the United Nations Nuclear Watchdog Organization, Yukiya Amano, says that even though the International Atomic Energy Agency has been monitoring Iran, it cannot credibly verify that all development in the Islamic Republic is for peaceful purposes, and that Tehran officials still need to provide a great deal of information in exchange for sanctions relief.
First, the IAEA member states and Security Council requested the IAEA to clarify the issues, what we call with possible military dimension. It means that Iran needs to clarify the information that indicates that Iran involved in the activities relevant for the development of nuclear explosive devices.
The United Nations Commission of Inquiry into last summer's 50-day conflict between Israel and Gaza has released its report, finding that those termed as Palestinian militants were hiding weapons at 3 UN schools in the Strip and found to have probably fired from those facilities on 2 occasions. The IDF is accused of launching strikes at 7 UN schools, 6 of which were being used as emergency shelters for Palestinians. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon released a letter with the report's summary, expressing his dismay that Palestinian militant groups would put United Nations schools at risk by using them as weapons arsenals, and that he deplores the fact that at least 44 Palestinians were killed and 227 others injured as a result of Israeli actions against the facilities. Speaking from Jerusalem, Foreign Ministry spokesman Emmanuel Nachshon said that Israel makes every effort to avoid harm to sensitive sites in the face of terrorist groups who are committed to not only targeting Israeli civilians, but also in using Palestinian civilians and UN facilities as shields. Hamas spokesman Sami Abu Zori told Reuters that his movement has no information about the storage of arms at schools, but that the report will be studied in detail and specialists will take it into consideration. Now, taking a look at local finance, the shekel today put in another mixed performance, while share prices on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange were down across the board. Here's a look at the numbers. The IBA weather team is telling us to expect a full-out desert heat wave tomorrow, although the end is in sight, so hold on just a little bit till it'll be a little bit more comfortable by Thursday. Here's the forecast at home and abroad over the next 24 hours. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. Laura Cornfield will be at this desk tomorrow to bring you the latest breaking news from Israel. I'm Erin Viner, wishing you a wonderful evening and shalom from Jerusalem.